Welcome back to the workshop. Today we're doing something legendary, forging a katana out of this massive, abandoned saw blade. If you enjoy watching a grown man fight industrial-grade steel for your entertainment, hit that subscribe button right now. First step is marking the profile. I'm sketching out the curvature of the spine and the tang. Time for the angle grinder, my favorite tool and my ear's worst enemy. I'm cutting the rough shape out of the saw blade. It's like slicing through a frozen brick with a butter knife. I'm leaving plenty of meat on the bone here. You can always take metal off, but putting it back on requires a miracle or a welder, and I'm currently fresh out of miracles. Moving over to the belt grinder to clean up those jagged edges. I'm using a low-grit ceramic belt to hog off the rust and refine the profile. This machine is finally set up and behaving, which is a rare treat. I'm smoothing out the machi, the notches where the blade meets the tang, ensuring everything is symmetrical and ready for the real work. Now we're grinding the primary bevels. I'm using the angle grinder to establish the initial taper. It's a bit of a cowboy technique, but it saves time. The goal is to move enough steel so the belt grinder doesn't have to do all the heavy lifting later. Just don't get too close to the edge yet, or you'll ruin the steel before we even get to the fire. Let's define the tang, or the nakago. This part is vital because it's what keeps the blade from flying out of the handle and ending my career as a YouTuber. I'm marking it precisely and cutting it down. You want a slight taper here so the handle fits like a glove. Back to the bench for some hand sanding cleanup. I'm using a sanding block to flatten the sides and remove the deep gouges left by the grinder. This is the part of the video that looks satisfying in time-lapse, but actually takes 4 hours and 3 cups of coffee. It's a great workout if you hate your shoulders as much as I do. Time for the heat treat. I'm building a traditional-ish wood fire because I'm out of gas and I like the smell of burning oak. I'm heating the blade until it hits critical temperature, around 800 degrees Celsius. You want a nice, even cherry red. Once it's non-magnetic, we plunge it into a tank of used engine oil for the quench. The smoke is just flavor. She survived. Now I'm cleaning off the scale to see the steel beneath. It's currently extremely brittle. Drop it now and it shatters like glass. We'll need to temper it later, but first, I'm taking it to the buffing wheel to get a glimpse of that future mirror finish. Buffing is where the magic happens. I'm using a polishing compound to bring out the shine. Watching the black scale turn into a silver reflection is the only reason I keep doing this. Just be careful. The buffing wheel is the most dangerous tool in the shop. It'll grab that blade and throw it at your shins faster than you can say, ouch. Let's start the hardware. First up, the habaki, or blade collar. I'm starting with a solid block of brass. It needs a slot that fits the tang perfectly. I'm marking it out and center punching it for the drill. Precision here is non-negotiable. If the habaki doesn't fit, the sword won't seat in the scabbard, and then you're just carrying a long knife. Drilling and filing the brass. I'm using needle files to square off the round holes from the drill. This is a game of millimeters. I'm constantly checking the fit against the blade. It needs to slide on with just a bit of friction. No gaps allowed in this shop. Now for the tsuba, the handguard. I'm using a thick brass plate. I'm marking out the central slot for the blade in a rough circle for the overall shape. I'm using an old grinding disc as a template because I'm fancy like that. Now, let's cut it out and see if we can turn this coaster into something a warrior would actually use. Grinding the tsuba to shape. I'm rounding over the edges on the belt sander, trying to get a perfect circle. Once that's done, I'm marking out the decorative cutouts. A katana isn't just a tool, it's a statement piece. I'm going for a classic 4-quadrant design. It adds style and reduces weight. Win-win. Back to the brass tsuba. I'm using a rotary tool with a tiny cutting disc to carve out these decorative windows. It's high-precision work, and if my hand slips now, this expensive piece of brass becomes a very shiny paperweight. The most satisfying part, knocking out the slugs. A few taps and the design finally reveals itself. I'm cleaning up the remaining bits with pliers, and it's starting to look like something a samurai wouldn't be ashamed to carry. Time for some manual labor. I'm using a flat file to square off the internal edges of the windows. Switching to needle files for the tight corners. You can't rush this part. If the lines aren't perfectly crisp, the whole aesthetic of the katana falls apart, and I've got a reputation to maintain, mostly with myself. Polishing the habaki, that little brass collar. I'm using a buffing wheel with a fine compound. Hold on tight. This machine loves to grab small parts and launch them into the shadow realm of my workshop. I'm flattening the faces on the belt sander. I need both sides of the tsuba to be perfectly parallel and smooth. It's noisy, dusty, and exactly how I like to spend my Friday afternoons. Now the tsuba gets the royal treatment. We're bringing out that deep golden shine. Watching the dull metal turn into a mirror is the only reason I put up with the smell of polishing compound. Don't forget to buff the outer rim. I'm smoothing every single edge until it practically glows. This is where a piece of scrap metal officially graduates into being a piece of art. Just look at that. 2 pieces of solid brass, polished until they reflect my tired face. The contrast between the cold steel and this warm gold is going to look incredible. The moment of truth, sliding the habaki and tsuba onto the tang. The fit is incredibly snug, which proves that even a broken clock and my measuring tape is right twice a day. Moving on to the woodwork, I'm tracing the blade's profile onto these light wooden blocks. These will eventually become the saya, or scabbard, providing a cozy home for our saw blade sword. Carving the channel with a sharp chisel. This is a game of patience. I have to follow the curve perfectly. Carve too deep, and the sword rattles. Too shallow, and it'll get stuck forever. I'm scraping away thin layers of wood until the blade seats perfectly flat. It's repetitive, but the smell of fresh wood shavings is a nice break from the metal dust. Back to the metal. I'm drilling a hole through the tang for the makugi, or retaining peg. This is what actually keeps the handle from flying off during a swing, so precision is non-negotiable. Marking the pin location on the wood to ensure everything aligns. If these holes don't match up later, I'll be having a very long, very loud conversation with myself and involving a lot of swearing. Time to get messy. I'm mixing up a batch of strong adhesive. This is going to bond the 2 halves of the scabbard together, hopefully until the end of time. Spreading the glue evenly across the surface. You don't want any dry spots where moisture could creep in, but you also don't want so much that it leaks into the blade channel. Clamping it down with everything I've got. You can never have too many clamps. Now we wait for the glue to cure while I go find more coffee and contemplate my life choices. Once the glue is set, we hit the big belt sander. I'm aggressively removing the blocky corners to find the sleek, oval shape hidden inside that chunk of construction lumber. Smoothing out the long, elegant curves of the scabbard. It needs to feel natural in the hand and look like a single, seamless piece of wood. We're finally seeing the final silhouette. Back to the belt sander to give this scabbard its final diet. I'm rounding off the edges until it feels like a smooth, oval river stone. If it's not comfortable to hold, you'll drop it, and cutting your own toes off is generally considered bad samurai etiquette. Back to the grinder to shape this tiny brass scrap. My fingers are dangerously close to the belt here, but hey, who needs fingerprints? It's a small price to pay for a perfectly fitted end cap that screams luxury, or at least I tried. Testing the fit on the wooden tip. It needs to be a seamless transition from brass to wood. If there's a gap, the samurai police will come for me, and I'm pretty sure they don't accept I was tired as an excuse. A little hand finishing with fine sandpaper. Sometimes the machines are too aggressive and you need the delicate touch of a man who's spent way too much time in a cold garage. This ensures the edges are soft to the touch. One last pass on the polishing wheel for maximum blind your enemy's potential. If I can't see my own reflection and my regret in this brass, it's not done yet. Look at that glow. Sliding the habaki and the handguard back on for a test fit. It's all coming together now. The weight feels right, and the balance is shifting toward the handle. It's starting to feel like a real sword, and less like a science experiment. Now for the handle construction. I'm applying some adhesive to the wooden core. This needs to be a permanent bond because the last thing you want during a practice swing is the handle deciding it wants to be a projectile. Cleaning up the tang area to make sure the handle seats properly. Any leftover gunk or wood chips will throw off the alignment, and a crooked katana is just a very long, very sad spoon. Let's talk handle aesthetics. I've got this white material. Traditionally, it would be ray skin, but today we're using a high-quality synthetic that doesn't require me to hunt any sea creatures. I'm measuring it out to wrap the handle core. Applying the yellow contact cement. This stuff is stickier than a bad reputation. The key here is to let it get tacky. If you rush it, the whole thing will slide around like a wet noodle. Wrapping the white skin around the handle core. I have to pull it tight and smooth out any bubbles. It's like putting a suit on a wooden man, and if the suit doesn't fit perfectly, the whole project looks cheap. Sealing the seam along the back. I'm adding a bit more glue to make sure the edges stay down. It's all about the details. A messy seam is a sign of a lazy bladesmith, and I'm only about 50% lazy today. Cleaning up the ends near the pommel. I'm trimming away the white wrap so the brass cap will sit flush. It's a lot of fiddly work, but this is what separates a backyard toy from a workshop masterpiece. poking through the leather to find the hole we drilled earlier. This is for the retaining pin. If I can't find it, I'll be poking holes in this thing all day like a confused tailor. There it is. Sliding the wrapped handle onto the tang. It's a tight fit, which is exactly what we want. Now we can finally move on to the most iconic part of any katana, the blue ribbon wrap. Get ready for some finger cramps. Starting the tsukamaki wrap with this vibrant blue ribbon. I'm securing the first fold near the guard. This wrap provides the grip you need to actually hold onto this beast without it slipping. And the crisscrossing begins. This is a traditional pattern that requires a lot of folding and tension. It's like origami, but with more swearing and sore thumbs. Each diamond shape needs to be identical, or it'll look like I did it in the dark. We're reaching the end of the handle. The diamonds are looking consistent, which is a miracle considering my patience level. Tucking the ends under the previous folds. This is the tricky part where the tension wants to release and ruin the last 20 minutes of work. I'm holding it down with sheer willpower and a bit of spit. A little bit of glue to lock the ribbon in place, and then the fire treatment. I'm using a lighter to melt the edges of the synthetic ribbon. It seals the ends and prevents fraying. Plus, I just really like playing with fire in the workshop. Look at that handle. The blue over the white looks incredibly sharp. It feels rock solid in the hand. We're officially out of the ugly phase. This saw blade is finally a sword. Time to fit the kashira, that brass end cap we polished earlier. I'm applying a dab of epoxy to ensure it doesn't rattle. It should slide over the end of the wrap perfectly, locking everything in place. It's the final piece of the handle puzzle, and it looks glorious. Woodwork time. I'm using the angle grinder to cut these boards. It's fast, it's loud, and it turns my workshop into a sawdust-filled snow globe in about 5 seconds. I'm tracing the blade's curve onto these pine strips, preparing to build the sandwich that will house our saw blade katana. Back to the blade for the final sharpening. I'm starting on the belt with a fine 600 grit to establish the apex of the edge. You can see the sparks flying. That's the high-carbon saw steel telling us it's ready to work. Just keeping it cool so I don't ruin the temper we worked so hard for. Now, let's finish the saya. I've got this blue synthetic leather that matches the handle ribbon. We're going for a full wrap look because bare wood is for people who have their lives together. Applying more of that high-octane workshop glue. I'm spreading it thin across the entire scabbard. This is a one-shot deal. If I mess up the wrap now, I'll be peeling blue sticky bits off this wood until the year 2028. Rolling the scabbard into the leather. I'm pulling it as tight as I can to avoid any wrinkles. It needs to look like a factory finish, not like I wrapped a gift while running for a bus. Smooth, sleek, and tactical. Trimming the seam along the edge with a fresh blade. My hands are shaking a bit from the 6 espressos I had, but I'm keeping the line straight. This is the moment where the scabbard finally starts looking professional. Now trimming the excess material around the koiguchi, the mouth of the scabbard. I'm leaving space for a white accent piece to give it that high-contrast custom shop look. It's all about the small details that no one will notice but me. Adding the final white trim to the ends of the saya. This really makes the blue pop. It's like the sword is wearing a tuxedo made of saw blades and recycled brass, but a tuxedo nonetheless. Look at this thing. From a giant rusty circular saw blade to a fully functional custom-fitted katana. The weight is perfect. The brass is glowing and the blue wrap is sharp. I'm almost afraid to actually use it. Almost. The moment of truth, the water bottle test. One clean swings and it slices through like it's not even there. The high-carbon steel from the saw blade holds a wicked edge. My neighbors can officially stop worrying. Well, about the sword, anyway. Thanks for sticking through this build. If you want to see more junk turned into weapons, hit subscribe and leave a comment. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a sudden urge to go find more giant saw blades. Stay sharp!